Thank you so much, Steve, and greetings to you all. Just coming from Harare this morning, and it's a pleasure to be in London.
With a visa.
Yes, I finally got a visa in Pretoria, not in Harare. The issues have been put on the table by Steve, issue of customary forms of tenure, issues of whether formalizing land rights is the way to go in Africa, or how are we doing with that? Issues of large farms, small farms, which is more efficient, which is the future, and the issue of the new land grab in Africa. What are the issues, and what does this all mean for the way forward? So these are the issues, and I'm going to take them sometimes in a combination. I'll try to go as quick as I can because I know the real issues will come in discussion. Here is what I think is the major challenge with the whole issue of land reform and tenure in Africa. The first is Africa is trying to figure out how to transition from being an agrarian society into an urban industrial society. It's something that is at the back of the minds of Africans from independence. Is something that they've always wanted to do, but the transition is not easy because the transition, it goes beyond just coming out of a colonial social order. It's about creating a new future of a social order. It's about an African renaissance. And it's not been a well debated issue in Africa. Land, if you look at industrialized society, including the ones that are fast industrializing in Asia, if land is not taken out of national politics, party politics, it becomes difficult to make the transition that we are talking about. So in Africa, it's about ensuring that that transition takes place. Because if land is still in the hands of a set of political elite, it's very difficult. How do we separate ruling classes from direct ties to land? So as I say, the Asian experience, whether it's Taiwan, India, China, of course starting with Japan after the Second World War, a major land reform leading to faster transformation of the society into an urban industrial society. Asia has done much better than South America, where the society is a little bit stuck in the colonial paradigm and still trying to figure out how to make that transition. And I think Africa, we are a little more like Latin America than we are Asia, in a sense that where land is still very much dominated by the plantation model, such as South Africa, Namibia, and Zimbabwe. It's still a major issue of conflict, where land in most of what you might older independent Africa, land is still, most of it is in traditional hands, but still government does not offer enough rights over this land, and that land is still very vulnerable, and there's no comprehensive policies on land or agriculture to make sure there is a forward movement. So let me start with land tenure approaches in Africa. I'm going to suggest that there are three major forms of land tenure reforms that are happening in Africa. There's what I call modernizing traditional tenure system to try and modernize it rather than westernize it. Examples are found in Botswana and in Uganda. Then there is the idea of nationalizing land, and the idea of nationalizing land is bigger in Southern Africa, where countries came out of colonization a bit later, and good examples are Mozambique, which has now gone through more than a decade of nationalizing land. Zimbabwe is trying to experiment also with nationalization of land. And then there are other states, such as South Africa and Namibia, where they believe it's in a parallel track, keep commercialization of land, the Western system, and keep the traditional separate. The laws are different. So I'm going to come back to all this later. My own position is we must modernize rather than westernize the tenure systems. And I will make that distinction because there's always a belief that modernization is the same thing as westernization, which is not quite true. By modernization, I mean keep the traditional system but bring it up to speed with modern systems of governance. And I'm going to cover that in a bit more detail in a minute. The reason why imposed Western-style tenure systems have failed in Africa is because tenure goes beyond just economic and legal issues. It goes into religion and other cultural aspects. But more important than that, my own work and many other people has confirmed that it's not so much what type of tenure system you're talking about. It is more about how secure is the tenure rights. So it could be leases, it could be title deeds, it could be whatever. It does not necessarily mean its security depends on the type. Rather, security is based on ability to have certain rights, not only legally recognized but also enforced. I'm going to go through those in a minute. Once you use the framework of the 4 important rights or categories of rights, then it becomes an issue of how they are administered rather than what type of tenure. And I'm going to go through that in a minute. The basket of secure tenure rights are 4 categories. The first is the category of rights for use of the land. If the law is clear as to what the land rights are for use, can you grow crops? Can you cut the grass? Can you build? Can you bury your dead? As long as those rights are clear, then the sense of security around rights is also clear. The second set of rights are transfer rights. Can you sell? Can you subdivide? Can you bequeath to your children when you're gone? Can you lease out? Those transfer rights should be clear. The third set of rights is exclusion rights. Who can you exclude from enjoying your rights over that land, and who must you include? If those are clear, it also makes it easy to transact and to mutate the rights. Finally is the enforcement rights, because I know that you in Western civilization, more so in the United States, the sacredness of property rights is something almost like God-given rights, because it's so entrenched in your culture. But actually, sacredness of property rights, which has fueled the idea of liberal democracy so well, is actually a society-given right. Because at the end of the day, what becomes important in a society is not so much that Steve has got the rights, I don't, or who has got it. It's about Steve knowing that anytime anybody wants to violate his rights, there's some force which can intervene on the part of society to protect those private rights. So this is legal, institutional, administrative provisions to ensure that it doesn't matter whether you're in a village or you're in an urban complex, your rights can be protected. If these 4 rights are recognized in law and an administrative process, then it doesn't matter whether the traditional system of tenure or it's a state-driven lease system, or it's a title deed. If those 4 rights are recognized in all those types of tenure and it's clear how they are administered, any tenure system can be as strong as any other tenure system. And that is what most African governments, I suppose the Western governments, don't know either. I'm proposing that for Africa to uphold these basket of rights for all tenure systems, it is important for African governments not only to have comprehensive land law, comprehensive land policies, but there's need for a comprehensive law which is derived out of the national constitution, which unites all these ideas in one law. That's why this is one thing I push all the time wherever I go and talk about this in Africa, because right now these are all scattered ideas around 3, 4, 5 pieces of legislation. You get your Western style tenure system contained in one law, then you have traditional systems contained in another law, etc. And then it's difficult to unite these into one socio-economic system. As I say, those 4 rights must be specified. Then what matters is how these rights are administered. And I'll explain to you in a couple of diagrams. I put here the four categories of land tenure systems the world over, it doesn't matter which one you look at, it would fall in one of the following four categories. And categories by the basis of ownership, on the basis of who actually owns the right. So open access land is where no one actually owns the rights. Although in most parts of the world today, you're hardly going to find open access land. Communal land, that is when a defined group does own those rights, and private land is when an individual or a group. And then state land, of course, is the public sector. On the basis of these four categories, you can then say the Western system of tenure can be regarded as similar to traditional African systems when you look at it from purely a point of who administers the four rights. Because in the Western system of governance, common land is either governed by the state, and those of us who grew up in a British colony, they used to call it crown land. I mean, when I was a small boy, they used to say, my father used to talk about, there's a crown land here. I didn't know they were talking about the Queen of England owning a piece of land in my village with crown land over here. State land, municipalities, associations will own common group rights over something. In the African system, it's a village court, it's a family, it's who administers those rights. And for freehold, same thing. In the traditional system, freehold rights can be either held by the family or an individual within the family. So what I'm getting at here, and it boils down to, if a post-colonial state in Africa is going to secure rights of people way down in the village where they don't even know a government exists, it is about recognizing the traditional system and strengthening it so that those rights are not only recognizable, but they can, if they have to be formalized and registered, they are then registered in their traditional format in a modern registry system. That's basically the direction I'm taking. But if you see what has happened in Africa over the last 100 or so years, where you start off is the pre-colonial period where it was a traditional customary tenure. Then after colonization, now you have a government, you've got a state, which, and almost every state in Africa at the colonial stage decided that the African tenure system was too complicated. These Africans were crazy. Everybody seemed to own everything, and everybody owns somebody's whatever. So it was easier for the government to suggest that all traditional land is state land, but we just let the Africans continue to ride the traditional system over our state land. And after independence, most governments just continued it. In my own country, in Zimbabwe, the government just said, oh, okay, the British are gone, but maybe they were right, it's state land. You know, and they continue owning the land that is owned by essentially traditional systems. So you have that initial change, then you have the situation where, of course, in Western society, you had the agricultural revolution here in England, and then the industrial revolution, and most people moved from rural to urban areas, and it was easy for the 3-5% that remained in the rural to consolidate their holdings into larger holdings. So it's one issue that most African governments don't realize, that you just didn't start with large farms. It was very small farms until you industrialized, and then it was possible to consolidate again. In Africa, 70% of the population is still rural, so it doesn't make sense to start by consolidating into large pieces of land where the majority of the people are jobless and landless. So the economics is a little bit backwards. But what happens is, and this is the biggest drawback with land rights in Africa, as soon as the government declares traditional land state land, but however leaves the traditional system still running, what happens over the decades is that people start recognizing that actually in law it's state land. So what used to be common land administered by the family or common land administered by the community starts deteriorating into open access land. Because whereas the village court system would have jurisdiction over that common land, who can graze that land, who can bury anybody on that piece of land, what the sacred sites were. Now, I can come back from London, an educated African, and say to my uncle, to hell with you, it's state land. I can go and build in grazing land because it's only the government that has right over that land, and the government is 2,000 kilometers away. They don't even know I'm doing that. So what was common land deteriorates into open access land. That's why you find then conflicts increase where traditional systems ensured that there was peace or ways to resolve any conflicts over land. Now there's even more conflicts and political fights over land. Now the implications for economic transformation are as follows, and I'm going to stick in here first of all the issue of economic efficiency and size over land. And I'm going to use the examples of Kenya, Zimbabwe, and China just to emphasize the point. The bottom line is, with the exception of plantation agriculture, bananas, sugarcane, and stuff like that, with the exception of plantation agriculture, there are no economies of scale in agriculture. You cannot say a large farm is more efficient than a small one. As a matter of fact, quite often small farms are more efficient than big farms. For that reason alone, it is purely an ideological argument rather than an economic argument that Africa needs to develop large farms rather than small farms. And there's evidence from all over the world to suggest that a society can promote its agriculture in such a way that small-scale agriculture can be the most profitable, or it can develop it such that large-scale agriculture becomes the most profitable. China, for almost 20 years now, is at one of the highest rates of growth in agriculture. And the average size of holding in China is 0.1 of a hectare. Okay, so it's not a size issue. It is a matter of ensuring, and in Africa, the biggest problem is African governments from this time that Africa was going independent in 1956-60, Africans who took over from the colonial masters had a vision of a fast industrializing Africa. And they saw Africa industrializing without them spending too much investment in agriculture. It was going to happen through investing more in education and building urban industrial complexes. So they did not understand that the English hundreds of years ago, when they had the Industrial Revolution, it's because they had a successful agricultural revolution. It's not easy to have an industrial revolution if you don't have an agricultural revolution to start with, because food has to be in abundance and affordable for those in urban factories. So Africans are trying to jump some stage of development here, and it's not gonna happen. The other issue is I'm gonna come to this also in a minute, because the issue of land markets and how to bring dynamism of producers coming in and out of agriculture as they see fit is an issue that needs to be addressed, and I'll come to that in a minute. The issue of traditional versus Western forms of tenure or title deeds, I've kind of touched on that, and I hope that I made the point that the major difference is more in the system of administration rather than the basket of rights. And with Western style government, power is centralized in the state, a government which is based in an urban area. And you in this Western civilization, the majority of you are in urban areas. So by power being in the state, in the city, and the governments being in the city, a lot of the rights that go with them can be administered more directly with the population, because most of them are in direct access to government systems. In Africa, it's the opposite. 70% of the people are rural. So although their rights are in theory registered with the state, when a woman's land is grabbed from her by some irate relative in a village, the government does not even know that's happening. So the village system needs to be back working again. The local government system needs to be back working again. It's a governance issue. Land tenure in Africa is a governance issue. And just westernizing westernizing land tenure does not work. And Kenya is a typical example. They started in 1955 with the Winterton plan, and they started formalizing traditional tenure into Western tenure. They go there and survey, they give title deeds, etc. It's taken more than 50 years to even start making sense of the system. For a start, the land was traditional land. It belonged to the family. It did not belong to the individual. But when the government started registering land, they registered it in an individual's name because it cannot belong to everybody. These Africans are crazy. So they put the head of household, and the head of household is Mandivamba Rukuni. And I go and trade and do whatever I need with the title deed. And a lot of families lost their land because the husband quite often never declared to the wife and kids that they have traded in for a loan at the bank. The bank forecloses, and that's the first time the family finds that they're destitute. So ultimately, it became socially difficult to foreclose on that land in Kenya. The other problem was, because of what had happened in the Western world, you cannot give title deeds to 3, 4, 5 pieces of land. And once again, Africans are crazy. They don't have all their land in one piece. They have a little piece behind the homestead, another piece near the ant hill, and another one, of course, near the river. You know. So Winterton plan comes in and says, no, that's ridiculous. What, it should be all in one contiguous piece. So Steve, you hand over your piece next to the river to Mandi, and then he takes your piece close to you, and so they reorganize everything so that land is in one contiguous piece. And as you can imagine, that not only disrupts productivity, because all these different pieces of land were strategically located for food security and growing different types of crops. So the whole economics of it was disrupted. This is my long way of saying, do not blindly westernize the traditional system without really understanding how the existing one was put in place. With today's technology, it's pretty easy using GPS and satellite technology to just map out wherever the land use is, record it as is rather than how the government would want it to be, and let that go into the registry system. And if there's any mutation, it can be dealt with through the local village court system, which then basically loads up the information with the state system, so that you have a highly decentralized system of administration and governance. What all the state is doing is ensuring that it provides an overall framework. The challenge in commercializing traditional land tenure is something that is well written, and De Soto's work in Latin America is the most prominent work, how to move from dead to live capital. In Africa, it's a big issue. The problem is simply in using De Soto's paradigm. If you're going to use real estate as capital, it requires a system where land and all the information around property and land, all that information is coded in such a way that it exists side by side with the financial market information system. Because, as De Soto would say, it's capital does not exist in the physical world. It exists in the conceptual world, because the attributes of the piece of land, which is 100 kilometers away from the bank, if those attributes are captured sufficiently in a national system, that's all the banks want to have access to. They're actually not always going to drive up to the piece of land and see it and make sure it's there every year. So it's only possible to have a national system where most of the rural land now exists in the world of finances, if you have a highly sophisticated and decentralized information system on the land. That makes it possible to transact in land without seeing it all the time. In Africa, that would take a long time just to be able to build such sophisticated registry and information systems. So never mind the ideological idea that give them title deed so that they can raise capital. The truth of the matter is, even if you're going to give them title deed, 90% plus of them would not be able to convert it to capital for the reasons I'm mentioning. So the implications on tenure are as follows for Africa. Decentralize the entire system, the legal, administrative, and political and governance process to village level. If it's not, it's going to be very insecure for land users. As I say, strengthen the traditional institutions of local government rather than weakening them. And African governments are very good at weakening the traditional systems because they think there's a way to build a nation. Kill all the tribes, make everybody the same, then it's easy to rule them and you're one nation. Well, it's too bad. It's a false society. Rather strengthen them as they are. It's just for me, and I tell my political friends, look, it doesn't matter what you do to me. I'm first and foremost an African. I'm not a Zimbabwean first and foremost. I'm first and foremost an African. Then secondly a Zimbabwean, by law, otherwise I'll something else. So communal tenure can be powerful, both socially and economically, because a lot of natural resources are contained at common property level. And most of rural Africa, where they're talking about wildlife, hardwoods, herbs, whatever it is, the potential is in this common property. And if those rights are also secured, they can make better use of them than they do now. Whereas right now, because those rights are in theory state land, influential people will come right down to the village and take over those natural resources and the rights. And that is what part of where the land grab thing is coming from. So just to conclude on the land tenure then, as I say, offer freehold rights to traditional system in a traditional sense. Give them a choice, don't restrict them to one system of tenure. And traditional systems can be as secure as any other system as long as the communities have the legal ownership and authority over their land and natural resources. Governments can assist this transformation by supporting and empowering local communities, strengthening traditional governance of systems, and decentralizing highly decentralized systems of governance. In 1994, as I was in the middle of chairing the Land Commission that Steve was talking about, I went for my actually first report to President Mugabe. I was given 30 minutes, and I was in there. I eventually extended it to 2 hours because I convinced him I was talking sense for that time. Anyway, he says to me, Chairman, are you suggesting that we give chiefs and all these people more rights over the land? I said, yes, Mr. President, precisely, but you give the system, not individual chiefs. He says, you know, Jerry Rawlings was in my office just a couple of weeks ago. Jerry Rawlings was still president of Ghana. And President Mugabe says to President Rawlings, oh, we're running this land tenure commission, blah, blah, blah. And Jerry Rawlings says to him, just don't make the mistake of giving more rights to the traditional leaders. They are a problem. And President Mugabe says, well, you gave the example of the University of Ghana in Accra, which asked for more land to expand their projects from the traditional leaders. And the traditional leaders declined more land to the university. So President Mugabe says to me, do you want that to happen to us? I said, precisely, Mr. President. Why? Because I've been around the country, and most traditional systems will offer land anytime to any projects that uphold their vision. It's more rare for them to decline. So if these chiefs decline the University of Accra land, you can be rest assured this university does not mean anything to these people. It's not offered them nothing over the years. So rural people should have the right, Mr. President, to decline government projects. And then the government, if they really believe the government needs to acquire that land for something that is bigger than the community, they can always acquire the land and compensate those farmers. But right now, most African governments will acquire the land, they won't compensate, because they say it's state land. They'll build a clinic wherever they want, they won't compensate. They'll build roads wherever they want. And the presidents are not even there to protect the people. So quickly on the land grab, because large tracts of land are really, I think we're now close to 5 million hectares in Africa, going for all sorts of things, agriculture, forestry, mining, and so on. And this phenomenon has been called land grabbing. Now, some institutions do not like the term land grabbing, because they think they would rather argue it's more about investment. So it's not land grab. But others are saying it is a land grab. So let's see why. The reasons for these acquisitions by foreign investors are differentiated reasons by foreign investors from Africans in the country. The foreign interests are more to do with the world commodity prices and food markets that have gone berserk. They're really trying to protect themselves. The demand for biofuels, because as you know, fossil fuels are now a serious issue. And some are simply to make money, investments into agribusiness, forestry, tourism, mining, and etc. But as you know, in Africa, there are a lot of foreign interests which are coming in to get land rights from either a government or a traditional chief or system. It's so easy for them to negotiate it, and most of the time they'll say agriculture, but they also have minerals and other things right there. I mean, there are all sorts of scarce resources that they're grabbing in the process. For Africans who are giving away this land, part of it are governments who are trying to industrialize agriculture at an accelerated pace. In some instances, it's an issue of food insecurity as well. In some instances, it's a rapid urbanization, which is now really worrying African governments, because although the urban population is a smaller population, they are politically more powerful. So you have to feed them, otherwise they take you out of power. And of course, there's self-enrichment by officials and traditional leaders as well. This is not in any order. In some countries, it's definitely, the last point is the main one. What the heck, give them $500,000 as long as I get my 10%. So here it's just in Southern Africa alone, an example of where the land is going. In Angola, it's mining and hydro. Madagascar, rice. Remember, in Madagascar, it's a big story. Malawi, it's cotton. Mozambique is everything from mining to rice to tourism, etc. So Zimbabwe is an interesting case, because unlike most of the other cases, it's more of the local. It's less of the externals coming to grab land for industrial purposes rather than the local influentials doing it for themselves. So the fear is that smallholders in Africa are going to lose a lot of their land rights, because the majority of them are still rural. So they'll be pushed off their land, and most of them are not sufficiently consulted in the process. But land grab is ultimately a governance issue. It is only possible because most governments don't have a comprehensive land policy, so they can get away with murder. Most governments have defined the rights of poor people very poorly. It's predicated to the state. A head of state is a custodian. It's all sorts of very weak definition of rights. Contestation of land and is therefore huge, even on the land that is so-called grabbed, is as to who actually owns it. Is it the government or the local people? The capacity to evaluate these investments is very poor. Even where governments are giving away large tracts of land, either they've approached a very competent foreign agency to evaluate it for them. I know when I was in the FAA office in Rome 6 months ago, and I went to the land office there, and they showed me a pile of requests from African governments. Can you help us evaluate these requests? Africans are not able to do that for themselves. So quite often they're giving away a lot of land for not much of a benefit. Capacity by farmers and farmer organizations to also contest is very limited. I mean, these farmers and farmer organizations need to fight it out with their own governments before the government concludes the deal. So there's a lot of work to be done capacitating these farmers and NGOs for this work. And more importantly, for agencies like ODI and other major players in the world, like the World Bank and so on, is developing principles and policies which can be shared across Africa around, if it's serious investment for the benefit of Africans, here are the principles that have to be followed to ensure that each investment can be evaluated against this. In particular, to ensure that the rights of poor people are not trembled upon, and that it's going to have a positive social impact. So, and I'm just about to finish, but I'll run through here. You know what's happening in Madagascar. The first attempt to give away 500,000 hectares resulted in a revolt. Remember, the government was overthrown, or almost. But they still went ahead and gave away another one. Ethiopia, 100,000 hectares in Mali, and considerable tracts have gone in Zambia, Nigeria, Mozambique, and other places. White commercial farmers have left Zimbabwe and given large tracts of land in those countries. China, as you know, is desperate for land, 2.8 million hectares in DRC for a large oil palm plantation, 2 million hectares in Zambia by the Chinese again to grow jatropha for biofuel. A number of British firms have secured tracts of land in Angola, Ethiopia, Mozambique, Nigeria, Tanzania. In Asia, as I say, you know, the Madagascar one, this attempt to negotiate a 99-year contract to lease 1.3 million hectares of land by Daewoo triggered a revolution, and the deal was cancelled. But another one followed immediately to an Indian company, Varum, to grow rice for consumption in India. So African governments are paying the price for not having invested sufficiently in long-term agriculture at the time of independence and beyond, like Asian countries have done. 15, 20, 30 years of investing more than 15, 20% of your national budget in rural areas and agriculture to ensure that land is fully developed and is secure, that you have an R&D process that brings up new technology for farmers, that, you know, is human capital at all levels, not just at a technical level. You need people who can farm and manage efficiently and so on. And of course, both biological and physical infrastructure, not just roads and dams and so on, but also genetic improvement of herds and plantations and orchards and what have you, and institutions that can perform for farmers. And finally, of course, a conducive policy environment. Because African governments have not done these things over a long period of time, they're now desperately trying to take a shortcut and find quick ways of fixing it. And as you know, that often does not work. So Africa needs comprehensive land policies. And that requires a political process and a consultative process that yields consensus for a good policy. It requires policies which have at least 3 strategic outcomes, maintains as maximum a number as possible at any time of productive farmers, and secondly, retains some dynamism to allow those who want to stop farming to go out and new ones can come in. And of course, for those who don't farm, to have access to homes and jobs. So all this is important, as well as being able to address historical and potential conflicts, inequalities, etc., etc. And I've talked about securing tenure for all categories of land. Should be in that comprehensive land policy. Upgrade the cadastral and registry systems to integrate all the land with financial services where it's appropriate. Clarify the role of the state so that it's restricted to few areas. The rest, they are overseeing that the rights are properly and integrate productivity and sustainability issues in policy, and encompass community-based natural resources management. Thank you very much.